Well, revelations a former New South Wales Deputy Premier's office had allegedly meddled with a $100 million bushfire recovery program have been referred to ICAC. It's the latest allegation, if you like, of political interference within recovery funding. Joining me now is Federal Minister for Emergency Services, I should say, Murray Watt, here in the studio. Thanks for your time.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Disaster funding, these are just the latest allegations. Do we need to take this out of the hands of politicians?
Look, I think ultimately these sorts of decisions are made by elected representatives, but I think what we need to make sure of is that we have really robust processes for determining who gets what, whether it comes to disaster funding or other forms. And of course, the former government made it an art form to rort that sort of funding, and then New South Wales former Deputy Premier John Barilaro was doing the same thing. So, you know, I think that we do need to make sure, and that's what we're trying to do with the processes that we're putting in place.
But I mean, what you're saying is, oh, the other guys did it, we won't. That is a bit of a red flag, if you like. Call me a cynic as a journalist when you hear a politician say that. Why not at least change the rules? What about this? I mean, if you as a politician make the decision, you release at the same time what it's based on, departmental advice, whatever it might be. And if you're differing from that, you say why. What about that level of transparency?
Well, that's certainly our intention when it comes to disaster mitigation funding that we'll be allocating through our new Disaster Ready Fund. We're in the process of taking applications from states and territories for that funding at the moment, and we'll be fully transparent as to what the ranking was, who got what and why.
And will that refer not just, because you mentioned states and territories, there are a lot of Labor states and territories right now. Are we talking about department involvement and what they've said?
Well, what the process that we've got in place is that when those applications are made by states and territories for things like flood levees, drainage improvements, bushfire evacuation centres, those kinds of things, we have a separate independent bureaucracy to make those decisions and recommendations to us, and I won't be interfering in them in the way that we used to see the former government do on a regular basis.
Okay. Now, the other aspect is repair funding. You did set aside $200 million for disaster prevention. So you've spoken about let's not just fix it up the same as it was before and it gets ruined again. That's still a drop in the ocean, well, compared to what maybe it needs to be. When you're doing this review, could that $200 million turn into something much bigger? Well,
I guess there's two separate things here. The Disaster Ready Fund, the $200 million a year, as you say, is expressly about investing in mitigation to prevent damage happening in the first place. But of course, beyond that, we continue to spend billions of dollars every year in recovery and repair after these events occur. And that's the funding that we've just announced a review of, headed by Andrew Colvin, the former head of the Bushfire Recovery Agency. What we want to do is make sure that those billions are also invested in a way that actually future-proofs us for future natural disasters as well. So I would expect that the full amount of money that's being spent on infrastructure and community resilience will be much bigger than that $200 million a year. But the key to that is that is a dedicated fund that doesn't rely on disasters happening in the first place. It's getting in ahead of the disasters rather than reacting. But there'll continue to be substantial funding after the event as well.
Right. But does that mean that the $200 million, is that just your sort of first dipping of the toe into this, that would be a lot bigger?
Well, the funding source for that is that the former government's emergency response fund, the one that I think we talked about a lot, that didn't spend any money on disasters. And that's effectively a future fund that is invested every year, and the $200 billion a year is effectively the investment returns on average coming out of that. So that's locked in, there's legislation to preserve it. What I'm saying is that there will always be additional funding from governments after disasters occur to help people recover. But what we need to do is do as much as we can with that extra funding to use it to prevent future things.
But if you're using that to do that, it won't go as far, right?
To build resilience into the system. Well,
you're not just rebuilding it the same. I mean, if it was going to also protect things, that's how we'd spend it anyway. Does that mean that fund? I take your point around the $200 million, but does that mean the other fund you're talking about might need to increase significantly?
Well, look, I think the amount that we end up spending after disasters is always going to depend on the size of those disasters. Last year was obviously a particularly significant year, and that's why we've ended up having to outlay so much funding.
But I guess the pro rata we spend on disasters, if we're building back better, I'm not sure if that's a slogan, but you can use it if you like, is the point of that it's going to build back more expensive?
I think it's reasonable to think that some of that infrastructure will be more expensive to repair if you're doing it in a way that makes it more resilient in the future. But that makes it much more cost effective in the long run. I mean, the examples I often give...
But governments don't think long term, that's the problem, right?
Well, the Albanese government does, Tom. You
sure.
heard it here first. No, but seriously, we've got to do better at using taxpayers' money wisely so that we can cut those costs down the track.
But again, forgive me for my cynicism, that you'll spend all this money up front and then maybe another government in 8 years' time will benefit from it. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, but I just think that Australians have got to the point where they actually expect their federal government to think this way and act that way. And we've listened to people, and that's why we're doing it this way.
Briefly on cost of living, the government is basically saying, we know it's tough, we can't do much. Inflation. Do you think that voters are going to be satisfied by that?
Well, I would disagree that there's not much we can do about it, and I think we are doing things about it. I mean, we've obviously brought in the cheaper medicines policy that took effect on the 1st of January. We've got cheaper childcare coming in 1st of July. We took pretty drastic action at the end of last year around energy prices that the opposition voted against. So I think in a range of ways we are stepping in to assist Australians. But the reality is inflation is high worldwide, and that's why we're trying to structure our budget in a way that we don't add to inflation, so that can come down over time. Of course, there's a really direct link between inflation and interest rates, so it's in mortgage holders' interest that we try to get inflation under control as well.